Hello and welcome to Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist and specialist in the ancient world.
And I'm Tom Pedrick, historian of modern Europe.
Today, Tom, as always, we'll be looking at a few artifacts. We're calling them artifacts even though they're relatively recent. We're using techniques that archaeology uses.
We're using objects just like I would use a primary source, all to understand people of the time.
Right, and today we're going to be looking at some artifacts that are actually images of people. So we don't usually think of photographs as artifacts, but of course they are. It's a physical thing that records an image. So maybe it's a cross between an object and a text because you can read it, I suppose. An image is readable in a way. It's true of any object, but I think for a picture, it's even clearer.
If a picture says 1,000 words and an artifact says 1,000,000, what happens when your artifact is a picture?
Right, then maybe they multiply, and now we've got 2 million. But yeah, exactly. We can learn a lot from any of these things, but just by examining the details in a photograph, I think we're going to really get in touch with. It's a direct connection to the past.
And the earliest known preserved photograph comes from France in 1826.
Right, so it's a good time to celebrate 200 years of photography, right?
True, and coming up a little bit later will be the anniversary of the first known selfie, which was taken in Philadelphia in 1839.
The photos we're looking at today are not as early as that. They're not the 1820s, 1830s. But how do we really know?
I would suggest strongly we go with our artifactualist questions to try to determine as much as we can about these objects. We'll go through the what, when, where, why, the how, and the who.
Right. We take this approach with all of our objects because we can act a bit like journalists to try to read these things, the language of the object. So we ask ourselves these questions and we look for clues to those answers within the object. In fact, you and I have talked a lot about photography now, and we've learned a lot because it's much more complicated than you might think. We're so used to taking pictures that we don't really question it.
That's true, and we have to remember that, say, in the 19th century, a person could probably only expect to get his or her portrait taken once in a lifetime, unless you were very, very well off.
Yeah, and that has to change the value. I mean, when you can only get one photo, you would really cherish it, I think. And nowadays, hundreds of
Absolutely.
them, we just got to look for the best ones that we can put on Facebook or whatever to try and show off, right? But I think we can move directly into our first artifact.
This is it. It is a tintype photograph with the original carrying case. Even though it's called a tintype, it's actually a ferrotype because it's made with an iron plate. That's why it's ferro. Now, it might have been called a tintype because tin shears were used to cut the plate. This one is actually 1/6 of an entire plate.
Yeah, so they could make a much larger one, but then they cut them into specific sizes, and this one
Right,
is one
right.
sixth of that bigger plate, right? Okay.
Absolutely. Now, for our when question, that was a little trickier. We had to spend a good amount of time on that. Unfortunately, there isn't anything stamped on the back that says 1883, John's photography. So we had to do some looking. The clothing this gentleman's wearing, that was our best clue. He's wearing high lapels, a high collar, and what's called a continental cross tie. Those three items together really points to the fact that this would have been taken in the 1880s. That was the predominant style at that time.
Right. I'm showing a close-up now of this gentleman. He looks rather dapper to me, I think, you
He
know.
does. Very
The,
well trimmed facial hair as well.
yeah, and there's that tie, kind of like a bow tie, but yeah, not quite the sort we might think of
Looks a
today.
looks a bit looser.
Yeah, and then that really, really high collar. It's several inches up there and it doesn't fold down. But that is so characteristic of the 1880s.
Right. It sticks up a good couple inches.
Right. I'm wearing probably my highest collar right now, and it's not even, well, it's maybe an inch. So
Right.
it
Right.
just wouldn't, it would look odd today. That's not their style. But
Yeah,
tin types
absolutely.
themselves, they'd been around for quite a while by this point, right?
Right. They started to appear in the 1850s. They're the height of their popularity was the 1860s and 70s. But of course, that doesn't mean people just stopped using them immediately. They've had a rebirth among, I guess you'd say, hipsters, but also steampunk enthusiasts, people
Hmm.
who like vintage photography. A couple celebrities have had their portraits taken this way too, including Kevin Bacon.
Right. And I think these are the ones, the modern ones, they tend to use the aluminum plate,
Right.
but it's still the same technique.
Right. It's this whole idea of using a black lacquer on the plate. Then it gets emulsified with something like silver nitrate.
Yeah, there are different silver compounds, but yeah, it usually is something like that. I mean, we're not chemists, obviously, but
Right.
I watched someone say, "Oh, this tintype is great because it's so simple. There's only 8 chemicals or so." I thought, eight? That sounds like a lot to me, but
Yes.
what do I know?
Any one of them could be complicated.
But basically, I think it is just it's exposing light-sensitive silver chemicals, and then washing away the ones that don't get exposed, so that you've got an image and the black shows through, the lacquer shows through to give you the shadows, and it
Right.
looks like a positive image. So
Right. And the image it's exposed to light in the back of the camera.
right, they have to actually slide it into the camera itself. So they call this wet plate collodion. So they put all of those chemicals on, and they've got to do it pretty quickly. I think a total of maybe 10 minutes before the whole thing dries out. So you put the chemicals on, you slide that into the back of the camera, you open up the lens to expose it, then close it again, and then you go and develop that image right on that plate. So it's kind of a one-shot thing.
You have to ask the why question. Why would people do it? Why would they want it done? And, well, why do we take photos of anything? To commemorate, to remember, and
Yeah.
to show others. Now, this is interesting too because we get into some real price differences here. Tin types were relatively cheaper and easier to create than the previous daguerreotypes. And daguerreotypes could be quite expensive. So, for example, in the 1840s, a daguerreotype might have cost about $30, which roughly that's $900 today.
Yeah, and
However,
that's
this
quite a
could
bit
be a
of money.
several months' pay for
Yeah.
one photo.
Well, and the daguerreotype, that's like that earliest photo we talked about, right? So back in the 1830s or so, this is actually on glass, and they were just developing it. So of course it was expensive, but then they start looking for new methods, and it gets cheaper, right?
Yeah, there was another method called the ambrotype, which would have run about $5, let's say 150 today or so.
Hmm.
Tin types were cheaper, not to mention more durable, so you could actually send them to people. I would say 18 in the 1870s, a tin type would be 50 cents, about $15 today. It dropped to 25 and eventually was at least advertised for as low as 5 cents. So
Right.
considerable
So
difference.
you're right. As tin types are fading out, they are getting cheaper and cheaper. But I think that is part of what will bring us into our next one is this whole idea of making photographs more accessible to more people. And so here we have our second artifact. And it too is a photograph, but as you can see, it's not on metal. This is on card. It's actually on paper that's then set onto a card. And these are called cabinet cards. We're not quite sure why cabinet, but it's probably because they were displayed either in or on cabinets. It's a pretty stiff card and a fairly standard size for these cards. You could be maybe a little more artistic, for example. You might use a lot of fading. So here's this, another dapper young man. But see how they've done this fading around the edges of his portrait. And that's a kind of stylistic, artistic way of displaying this. And there are a couple of big differences here between this and the tin type. First of all, you could make multiple copies of this because it's actually made from a negative. But that negative was on glass, kind of like the ambrotype. Then you prepare paper with albumin. And albumin is essentially it's just egg white. So to me, this is really interesting. It's like you're coating your paper with egg and then using the glass negative, and you put it actually down after you've dried that a bit. You put the negative down onto the paper and shine a light through it, and now you're exposing the paper through the negative. And that means you can make another piece of paper, put a same negative down, and you can make copies quickly. They're certainly cheaper than the early days of photography, but a dozen prints or so would run around $2. And that's not too bad, and it's comparing with those tintypes, but you could always go back and get more because the negative was on file. The time period, again, very similar to what we had to do with the tintype. We had to kind of read the clues. We know that this gentleman is wearing a particular kind of clothing, and in this case, he has a bow tie that is a bit different from the cross tie that we looked at. His lapels are quite large. His collar is high, but not as high as the man that we saw before. Now, we're looking once again, most likely in the 1880s or up into 1890s. It's probably a little bit later than the tintype that we had before. Cabinet cards were introduced in 1863, and by the time 1900 comes around, they're pretty much the main way people would get their photographs done. But there's another big clue. We will look at the back. There is writing on this one, so in fact we are reading it like a text in this case. And it says J.R. Pearson, artistic photographer. So he's really proud of his photography, and he's not just a photographer, he's an artist. And he is there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So in this case, I could look up this photographer. Sure enough, I found him, James R. Pearson, in operation from about 1874 until about 1895. So that's already putting our framework in there. We know it has to fall somewhere in that time period. And cabinet cards kind of went through a bit of a phasing. It was popular to have certain characteristics on the back. So here we are looking at the back. It's gold writing on a black background. It's also got rounded edges, and they are beveled, kind of. Let's see if I can show just what that edge looks like. Hard to see, but the edge is angled and it has the gold coloring to it. Now this was a style that was very common right up there around 1890 or so. And the why, once again, it's to commemorate. It's to remember this person. Either it was for his family, or maybe it was one that he carried around himself, or that you handed out to people.
Well, so now people could buy many copies, not just the one tintype.
Yeah, you would wonder, why would anyone go for a tintype? But maybe if they are down around 5 cents a piece now, a one-off, and I've heard that they used to set up at festivals or something, somebody on the roadside, and it might be a whim. You might say, oh yeah, I'll get my picture taken and I can have that one little shot.
I imagine the photographer showing up with a wagon. Maybe he has the dark room in there.
Well, that's the thing with tintypes. You could develop them on the spot, but you needed a dark room, but you would do it in a kind of a wagon probably,
Right.
sealing off all the light, and you can do this pretty quickly.
Traveling office.
Right. And I'd always thought, though, that, I don't know, somehow I saw this as a linear progression. You went from Daguerreotype and to the ambrotype and to the tintype, and these were all kind of one shot. And then finally they learned, hey, we can put this on paper and we can make lots of copies from negatives. But things don't really happen 1, 2, 3, 4. They kind of happen 1, and that gets really popular, but 2 is developing, and 3 also. And so you're using many things all at once, and then something becomes more popular, or because it's cheaper, or they develop it to where it works more easily. So, in fact, they were using these paper prints back in the 1860s, but tintypes were most common then.
I imagine that the portable tintype experience was just a little more laid back than being in a portrait studio. Sometimes you had to sit very stiffly for long periods of time.
Well, exactly, and sometimes they, I think, even used a head brace where they had to kind of lock your head into a thing so you wouldn't move, right?
Right. No wonder nobody in these pictures was smiling.
They have a very serious look to them. But usually they would expose using sunlight because they needed bright light, and it was hard to get that from artificial lights at the time. But I was really interested to find out that flash photography had existed for a long time. Really, the first flash was really back around 1840 or so, and it was calcium carbonate, which is also called limelight. And it is very bright, but it's a chemical reaction. And by 1862, they're using magnesium, but this burns really hot and very quick. That's how you get the light. The problem is it's dangerous. So photographers would get burned. Sometimes the subject of the photo would get burned. There are even some cases where a photographer was actually killed from a magnesium explosion like this in a flash.
Oof. So, in general, sunlight was still preferred for these photos, right?
Sure, I think for the majority of them, even in the studio, I think they would have big windows so they could get enough light into the room because they preferred to use that when they could. Obviously, you want to take the photo as quickly as possible because the longer you expose, the more chance that you're going to blur just from any slight movement. Movement can really make things look odd in a photo.
Yeah, it can almost look supernatural because it blurs.
Yeah, like a ghost or something, or if something moves through the scene, you get this streak, if someone walked past,
Right.
and yeah,
Well, some use the blurs, the light leaks, or double exposure to claim they had actually captured ghosts on camera.
yep, the supernatural has always been popular. I guess people want to believe, right?
Right.
And so then some people would engineer this to make sure they could make those blurs and claim, oh no, I can take a picture of a ghost, which
Right. Well, our guy in the tintype is very still. The resolution is very clear.
And, we would today say it's high resolution, but it's not quite like counting pixels.
Right.
But the bigger your plate at the back of that camera, the higher your detail is, your resolution. So these are really, those early photographs, very high resolution. You could scan them now at a super high pixel rate and still get very clear image.
True. A very clear image, but not a very clear image of who this man was.
No, we don't know his name, right?
Right. I wish we did. I
Yeah.
wish it was written there, but we don't. We can make some guesses about his background, some educated guesses. He seems middle class. He would have spent some money on his clothing. He's made a very serious effort to present well. It would not have been extremely cheap to get this photo, and with the original case, the
Right.
process would have been even more expensive.
We haven't talked much about the case, so I'm going to show an image of this. So this is the tintype, but it's turned over, so we only see the back of it. And I could show that in the close-up camera as well. There was a hinge, but that has broken. But we see that it's lined here with a kind of velvet material. And the case itself has that kind of shiny black
Yeah,
color to it. What is
yeah.
that?
So this is a molded rubber, and I don't know quite if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but it's called gutta percha.
Yeah, gutta percha. It just kind of means the rubber from, I don't know, one of the Pacific Islands or something where this stuff was brought in from, right?
And then what you also see is a metal photo, of course, the tintype in a thin brass frame.
Yeah, that helps to protect it. And I don't want to take this apart again, but I did take it apart, and I want to show all the components of that photo, so you can see the case above, and then the photo and its brass frame below. And there was this white card insert too that does look like it has some numbers on it, and I had really hoped that was a date, but
Right,
it's
right.
not. It's something like 13, 78 or 18. It's hard to read.
And overall, this case is just very typical of photo cases from the United States.
Right, so that's getting into our where, right? Where was this taken?
Right. We can't be any more specific than that. We don't know a individual state or city. European case sizes were typically bigger than this photo size. The size of the plate also indicates that this was taken in the United States. I
And
would love it if it had a city
I
mentioned, but
know, and I guess that's a good thing about the cabinet card too, is that it does actually tell us where it was taken. So we know that it's in Pittsburgh, and it's this J.R. Pearson. And I had a lot of fun trying to really narrow this down. When I was looking through, I found this James Pearson, but prior to that, in the 1860s, there was another Pearson who, I don't know if he was related, maybe he was, because they're in the same town, and so I'm guessing it's probably his father. And a directory will often list, well, where you live and occupation. So, for J.R. Pearson, it says photographer. But on this other one, I think it was J.C. Pearson, it said gentleman. So, his profession, I imagine this, it comes up, oh, what do you do for a living? I'm a gentleman.
If only it said something like gentleman extraordinaire.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it just meant that he was well off and he didn't necessarily have to work or something like that.
Right.
I have no real idea. But I just found it humorous. We've talked a bit about the how already and this idea that you coat it with egg white. It comes with a rather sepia tone, I guess is what we call it, right? It's brownish. And often we think of old photos in that sepia. But the oldest ones are really more silvery because of these silver nitrates, which they would use here too, but the albumin actually makes it turn kind of brownish. And once again, we want to know who this person is. We know who his photographer was, but we don't have the name of the young man here. So, I don't know. I'm sure he lived in or near Pittsburgh. And he too seems relatively well off. He's got some nice clothes, and he could afford to get his photo taken. Not extremely expensive, but it's something that you had to think about.
Well, something I found interesting, that the photographers also sold images of famous people from negatives they had stored. A very popular one was Abraham Lincoln.
Right. You could get a picture of essentially celebrities of the day. I mean, it's not that unusual, I suppose, for us to have pictures of famous people. And in the past, that was true too.
Right. And you're showing and displaying to people you're interested in politics and current events, and you can afford one.
Yeah. And photo albums were really big sort of signs of importance, maybe, or of affluence, because I've seen a number of portraits where it's usually a woman, an older woman, and she's usually holding her photo album. Lots of pictures of her family, and that's so important that she goes in and gets her picture taken with the album.
These albums could be something to brag about, something to show people. It's kind of like in movies and TV, there would always be a joke about people going on vacation and bringing their slideshow home, and everybody was bored to tears.
Right. Well, I think if you have slide after slide of kind of the same thing, and here's another thumb over the lens, and of course.
Right.
But when you might only have a few dozen photos, they're probably of great interest, and people loved, but you didn't have TV and things like this, so you look at pictures.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
And today, as always, we're trying to really bring these things back to life, try to understand the object and the people. So I found this interesting app online, and it's called the Deep Nostalgia app at myheritage.com, and it's really interesting. You can go there and upload an old photo for free, and it will animate it. So I was going to say, we've tried to bring these people back to life. We don't know their names, but here they are kind of looking back across more than 100 years. And I don't know, it feels a little eerie to me.
Yeah.
But very interesting. It's a good app. It really does look like they're moving. These are the people from that time. I don't know if it helps us identify with them more, maybe a bit, just because we think of movement as closer to a person than a still image.
Sure. It's another reminder that they were human, just like us, just in a different time.
Yeah. And that's our goal. We've tried to do it. Obviously, we can't answer all the questions here. We always learn more and more, and we can look back at these objects and think about them again. But I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and join us again on the next Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford.
I'm Tom Pedrick.
And we'll see you again. Yep.